All right, let's get this video started. My name is Jeremy Sims. This is Boring Bible Study, and we are going to be looking at the Bible closely today. Specifically, we're going to focus on Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 14, if I'm recalling correctly. So, should be a short one, just 4 verses, nothing kind of crazy in here. What we're going to see is that Paul is going to call Peter on some nonsense he was doing, and Paul is going to use that as a springboard to start talking about the doctrinal issues in question in the book of Galatians. And just quick recap, in this case, this happens to be your first video. Essentially, Paul is writing this to say, hey, you guys have been infiltrated, you Galatian churches have been infiltrated by this group called the Judaizers, who are trying to convince you you need to keep the Mosaic law to be a real Christian. And that is nonsense, and I'm going to explain why it is nonsense. And that's the book of Galatians. So, we've pretty much wrapped up the section where Paul was trying to establish his credibility. This is kind of the end of it here, where he was trying to say, these are the reasons you should listen to me. You know, in the previous videos, previous parts of the chapter, he was kind of trying to explain his history, how he came to know the gospel, the authority that he had, his interaction with the other apostles, and that they actually agreed with him on stuff. And now we're going to see this confrontation between Paul and Peter. And again, he's going to use it as a springboard to talk about the greater doctrinal issues at play, but we're just going to kind of cover the springboard itself at this point. In terms of what we're discussing today, there's nothing that stands out as particularly key. There may be a little bit extra time spent on why Peter felt the need to separate himself from the Gentile Christians, so we'll look at that a little bit. And other than that, let's just get into it, I guess. Always like to look at the previous passage we covered in the last lesson just to kind of get some flavor as to what got us to this point in the discussion. So let's go ahead and go to the beginning of the chapter. We'll go through verses 1 through 10 real quick and then go through 11 through 14 and start breaking it down more carefully. If I can find the passage. My favorite, the app I usually use to read the scriptures is down, Blue Letter Bible, or it's not down, but it stopped working properly in my browser, so I'm having to use another one, and it's a little counterintuitive to me. You just kind of get used to where things are laid out on one web page. All right, Galatians 2:1. Then, after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. So you remember Paul's trying to point out that he did not spend much time in Jerusalem, therefore he did not get his authority from the other apostles, because it seemed to be they were insinuating, hey, Paul wasn't a real apostle, he just got his authority from the other guys in Jerusalem. And he's made a very clear point, no, I did not. So he took up Barnabas and Titus, both two people who worked with him closely. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles. So he got some sort of revelation from God saying he needed to go there. He lays out the gospel that he was giving to the Gentiles, and we'll see how they react to it. Also notice that he's doing this privately. That's going to be something of interest, since we'll see what we covered today is definitely not in private, so that's an interesting contrast to kind of wonder what the differences is between handling these two different disputes. So, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. So in other words, we want to make sure that the churches in Jerusalem weren't coming to the wrong idea on this Judaizer issue of whether people had to keep the Mosaic law to be real Christians, seemed to be the idea here. And he's saying that I didn't want them to come to the wrong conclusion, because that would mess up a lot of the ministry that I had been doing all this time. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. So here we have somebody who's a leader of one of the churches, Paul's right-hand man. Presumably, the church would have said, hey, he needs to be circumcised if it was an important issue, and he's saying that was not the case. Circumcision, of course, being a sign of being underneath the Mosaic law. That was like the visible first thing you would do. I mean, not visible to everybody, but, it would be the thing you would do, the visible sign of going into the covenant. So it was very emblematic of that. And he's saying they didn't insist on that because they didn't expect to keep the Mosaic law. Yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery, to them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel may be preserved for you. So they had this dispute, they had it out in private, no doubt leaders from the Judaizer side, and Paul kind of representing hey, I'm the one who's going to all these Gentiles, converting them, this is what I'm preaching, and making his case for why he believed that was correct. And though from those who seemed to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles, and when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. So in other words, the apostles in Jerusalem that the Judaizers seem to be saying was on their side of this issue, in reality, they were actually on Paul's side of that issue. When the case was laid out before them, they were Team Paul. They were Team, you don't have to keep the Mosaic Law. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. And we talked about that last time, how Jerusalem in particular was facing a lot of challenges due to probably some persecution from the Jewish community there, Gentiles as well to a certain extent, but especially the Jewish community, just because it's the hub of Judaism. And from their perspective, they were seeing Christianity as an aberrant, new version of Judaism, which was actually blasphemous. So they'd have some hostility there. They were undergoing a famine. So lots of reasons for Paul, who was going to other regions of the world, to have an incentive to bring charitable contributions back to the Church of Jerusalem. So they're like, hey, while you're out there, bring stuff back. And there may have been other reasons, too, for them to want that. All right, so today's lesson, 11 through 14. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? All right, so let's go back up to the top. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. So Cephas is just another name for Peter. I believe that's the Greek form, whereas Peter is the Hebrew form. Don't hold me to that. I'm not looking it up, but I believe that's correct. So when Cephas came to Antioch, what's the deal with Antioch? Well, Antioch is a church that Paul spent at least a year at ministering to people. In fact, it's actually a church that Barnabas also ministered to. And it's also in the area of Galatia. So Paul's not just mentioning some random place that the Galatian church would have known nothing about. This might be an incident that they're all familiar with. At least it's reasonable to think that some of them would have been familiar with. So it's kind of in their own backyard. Let's read Acts 11:19 through 26. This talks about Barnabas and Paul going to this area. Now those who were scattered because of the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except Jews. But there were some of them, men of Cyprus and Cyrene, who on coming to Antioch spoke to the Hellenists, Hellenists being a name for the Greek Jews, also preaching the Lord Jesus. And the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number who believed turned to the Lord. The report of this came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. So we see the gospel spreading out to other regions as the persecution was increasing, and the church in Jerusalem says, hey, let's send send Barnabas to Antioch. He's a good dude. When he came and saw the grace of God, he was glad, and he exhorted them all to remain faithful to the Lord with steadfast purpose. And for he was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, and a great many people were added to the Lord. So Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. For a whole year they met with the church and taught a great many people, and in Antioch the disciples were first called Christians. So yeah, that was Barnabas's place. He recruited Paul to also help him out. Kind of wonder what the backstory was there. I don't know if that's covered somewhere else in Scripture, how they knew each other, but somehow they did. Barnabas, or at least Barnabas, knew of Saul and wanted to recruit him, and so they were working that church together. And somewhere I got the idea that they were there for at least a year. Some commentary said that. I don't know what their evidence for that is, but I know people spend a lot of time working out the timelines on this sort of stuff. And if I recall correctly, I'm looking at my notes, which are not as clear as I wish I had made them, but if I'm recalling correctly, there are a couple of Antiochs, which could be the Antioch in question. I'm not sure they know which one's which. One location is in modern Turkey, and another one is somewhere in Europe. I don't know. Whichever one this is, I don't know the geography off the top of my head, sorry, but it's in the Galatian region, so I'm sure if somebody wants to spend some more time, they can figure that out. or make a better guess than I have, trying to remember what my vague notes meant. So, some keep in mind we're going to see Paul have a rather strong reaction to Peter's behavior here. And why? Well, again, this is a church he spent a year with, so he's seeing people hurt his brethren, these Gentile Christians he'd spent all this time trying to convert. And here you have Peter, one of the most prominent, maybe the most prominent apostle, disrespecting them, making it appear like they're less than, maybe that they're not even real Christians. It's a pretty big deal, right? So when we see Paul react rather strongly, you can kind of imagine if this was like his personal flock he's seeing this happen to, those that he oversaw. And of course, I think that's a good thing for us to keep in mind as well, is, God's given us all things, and many times people that we are in charge of, in a certain sense, to look over, to look after, to help out. And, for us, we should take that seriously too. And we should have some strong reactions when people start messing with them and harming them. Something else to keep in mind in terms of Paul having the strong reaction is that we just came off the section where Paul laid out what he was teaching the Gentiles, and not just Peter, but also James and John all agreed, yep, good stuff, you go do that. And now Peter is acting in a way that's inconsistent with that. So it's like, come on, it's not like you're some random person who didn't know better. You knew what I've been teaching people. You agreed with me that it was the right thing, and now you're going to act this way? We'll get into that more later. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. So we see this confrontation. He comes right out at him. And, again, we have to be willing to do that too. We have to be willing to correct our brothers. We have to be willing to say a sin is a sin amongst people who are not brothers. We have to be willing to confront. That's part of being a Christian. It's part of being a good person. If you can't stand up for yourself and, more importantly, the truth, then kind of a wuss, aren't you? So we need to not be wusses. We need to be able to take stands. And of course, I think there's a lot of kind of wussy churches out there that don't want to call a spade and say sins are sins and make people uncomfortable. But because it doesn't feel loving, I think, is the idea that really, I don't know what to call them, wussy Christians. I'll use that so I don't get specific and use something more offensive by calling out specific names. But we'll say wussy Christians who have this idea that, let's just be loving. It's all about love. Well, it's not loving to allow somebody to go down a path of destruction when you know it's going to hurt them. That's not loving. And here Paul was saying, really was hurting Peter too, because anytime you break with the truth, it's hurting Peter, but especially those people that were being influenced by him. He was influencing, all the other leaders. He was influencing the congregation itself. So really important to nip this thing in the bud. So when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. Something else to think about in here is the whole Catholic Pope thing, because according to the Catholics, Peter is supposed to be the Pope. Now, I'm not a Catholic expert. If I was going to make a real strong case, I'd need to learn a lot more about Catholicism and look into the apologetic arguments the Catholics would have against this. But I'm just going to point out that Paul calling Peter the supposed Pope, the vicar of Christ, the one with the most authority here on earth, calling him out and saying, man, you're really messed up. It doesn't seem like the general way Catholics are taught to treat the Pope. Now, there's a common thing with Protestants Protestants that haven't been taught very well, that says that the Catholics believe the Pope is flawless, has no problems, they can't sin, or at least he can't teach anything bad, and that's not actually true. At least I've heard that. I don't know how common it is. I suspect it's pretty common. But they actually do not believe he can't make mistakes or can't even teach anything incorrect. Rather, they believe that when he makes specific proclamations, and I'm fuzzy on this again, no Catholic experts. I think it's something like in cathedra or cathedra, and I'm probably slaughtering it. Something Latin, I'm sure. When he's making like an official proclamation of this is official church doctrine, you're get with it or get out kind of thing. There are certain ways he can speak, which this is the new thing, and this is perfect. Now, I suspect, and I've heard there are all sorts of holes you can punch punching even those supposedly perfect proclamations, but I haven't looked into that. I don't know. Regardless, though they don't say he's perfect, you would think, I mean, logically, if you say, okay, he's only perfect at those points, at any other point he's fully open to criticism, right? He should be criticized just like any other person. That would be my thought, or at least like any other person in authority. There are parts in the Bible which talk about, the church leaders, older, or I don't know if it even says church leaders, but at least those that are older should have a certain amount of respect, like, talk to them like they're your father. So there is some authority that, maybe some deference there. But regardless, still, you should be able to critique there, right? I mean, pastors, any other form of authority mentioned in the Bible are never said to be above criticism. And yet there's a culture in Catholicism which very much does discourage harsh criticisms of the Pope. And to make sure I wasn't making stuff up, I did some looking into it. Here's an article from RC Spirituality. I think I was looking for I think I just Googled, like, can you criticize the Pope? And I got this. So it says, yet while it is true that not everything a pope says is infallible, we still owe him a high level of respect and obedience. Which, respect and obedience, two very different things. He is the vicar of Christ, after all, the visible head of the church on earth. As such, he enjoys a special grace of state, and he certainly has wide authority within the church. What he says should not be dismissed as just one voice, one opinion among many. At the very least, we should give him the benefit of the doubt when he decides on prudential matters. Catholics who constantly criticize the Pope and his actions and teachings could be falling into sins against charity and even against faith. Whoever listens to you listens to me, and whoever rejects you rejects me. From Luke 10:16, which I looked that up the other day, and just in case you were wondering, does not have anything to do with Peter. It's a general thing for when Jesus sent out, I think, the 70 or so. He seemed to be saying it to those people. But yeah, it wasn't a singled out Pope thing for sure. At the very least, we should give him the benefit of the doubt when he decides on prudential matters. Oh wait, no, I read that. Luke 10:16. A person who has difficulties with a Holy Father should turn to prayer and ask the Holy Spirit for light and guidance. Faith sheds light on even the darkest corners of skepticism. So it makes me think of something pretty passive aggressive, because it's like, can you criticize the Pope? Yeah, but don't. Seems to be the idea. Like, theoretically, yes, but practically, no. Anyway, all I'm saying is Paul's actions towards Peter here do not seem like the most popish thing that I have ever seen. The level of popish deference that seems to be recommended by the modern Catholic Church. So, anyway, but when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. Now, that's an interesting phrase, he stood condemned. Because, again, coming back to the idea of we need to take stands, we need to be able to confront people when they're in wrong, lovingly, carefully. There's billion addendums to put onto that, but still, it's part of the ministry of the church is to correct people when they go wrong. So, an interesting way of thinking about this is that it's not like you're actually condemning people. In a certain sense, it is, but rather, notice Paul says here, Peter was already condemned. He stood condemned. Before Paul did anything, he was already condemned. And that's something to realize. In a sense, yes, by noticing that somebody is doing something sinful, you are, in a sense, passing judgment on them and saying, hey, that was wrong. That's a certain form of condemnation. But in the greater sense, in the more important sense, it doesn't really matter so much what we say. It only matters what we say as much as we're in line with Christ. Because in truth, it's the fact that God condemns people. That's the real problem. And of course, this throws me back to, we see this same idea explored in John 3, verse 16 through 21. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and the people love the darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his work should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. So yeah, really that 17 and 18, whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already. So yeah, just a way of thinking about things. There's a big culture against judgment. Personally, when people accuse me of being judgmental, I don't really mind that because, yeah, I judge things. Hopefully, I'm not a jerk about it, but yeah, I'm not going to see you do something bad and not notice. And I might not say something. If you ask, I'm certainly going to say something. I'm certainly going to judge and notice whether it's good or bad. Anyway, I know there are different connotations to those words, but yeah, judgment, condemnation, it's ultimately about God, not about us. Doesn't mean we don't have a responsibility to do our part, but God is the one who has the binding power to decide what is right and what is wrong, and what happens to people, and what's the suitable punishment for their sins. We're just supposed to reflect that. So, moving on. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. So notice it says these men were from James. So James seems to be, what the evidence seems to indicate, that he was the chief elder in Jerusalem. So he sent people, maybe as kind of representatives of him, to check in on the churches, or who knows, it doesn't really say. But some people that came from James, and Peter got nervous about it. Now, the natural inclination of most people, most commentators, seems to be that to assume that these men that James had sent were Judaizers. And it's possible, could be. It would certainly make sense in a certain sense that that was the case. But there is a problem in that we just saw that James, in the earlier section, was saying, okay, what you seem to be preaching to the Gentiles is good. Go for it, Paul. So that would seem to be in contrast, since, the whole issue is around what the Judaizers are teaching, this idea that you got to conform to the Mosaic law. So there are still counter-arguments to make to that. You can say that, well, maybe they had accepted the idea that they could be saved, but weren't quite clear on what the rules were, and that's reasonable. That could be the case. But with a lack of definitive evidence, I would still probably want to side against assuming that James was sending representatives who were representing something that Paul in this entire book was calling a heresy. Again, most people think that Galatians is being written before the Jerusalem Council that totally settled this issue in the mind of the apostles, so there's room for wiggle room, but I don't know. Again, just without being able to, I would assume James wouldn't select people that were heretics. Basically what it comes down to. But maybe they weren't heretics because they didn't have enough information. So you can make an argument either way. So here's some other reasons. Maybe they were Judaizers, maybe they weren't. I'm inclined to think they were not, but we really don't know. So why would Peter then be concerned about it? Well, even if they were not Judaizers, they're going to talk, right? They're going to talk to other people. So let's say they weren't actually personally concerned about that issue. It would have still been something noteworthy and worth reporting. And then when it gets back to the church, then the Judaizer sect would know that and be concerned, and it might cause a little uproar. And Peter knows that. Like, who wants political uproar? Who wants people to be mad at you? Nobody. Nobody enjoys that. Okay, a few people enjoy that. Most people do not, right? It might threaten his leadership. It might threaten his popularity. And, we shouldn't be motivated by those things, but very few of us are not. So yeah, it's a legitimate concern. It could also be that these people coming from James did not necessarily think that there was a religious problem, a theological problem with him sitting with the Gentile, Peter sitting with the Gentiles, but it could have been, hey, we're here more geared towards the Jewish community. We're going to try to convert some of them, and seeing you sitting with these Gentiles, which is not something cool amongst the Jewish community, that's going to make it harder to do our job, Peter. So can you just not do that? Make all our lives easier? So yeah, not clear, but there's some food for thought to chew on. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. So Peter didn't have any problem with it before these men arrived. So he didn't have, which means he didn't have a theological issue with it. He knew it was fine. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself. So and I believe some of the commentators say this almost makes it sound like it was a big public thing. Like, it wasn't like the next time he came in, he just sat with the Jewish people. Rather, something about the language, I believe, if I recall correctly, some of the commentators were saying it makes it seem like it was a scene, right? Like they got up and separated out as soon as he saw these people come in. So why separate himself? Well, that's a good question, and I didn't come up with the most excellent answer, unfortunately. So the closest I could get in terms of, there's a question here which I'll address later, but was this separation something prescribed by the Mosaic law, or was it a Jewish customary thing, or was it a mix? And I'll explain that a little bit more in detail. But so the clearest thing that would fit into what I would expect would be there to be a specific Jewish prohibition. So there, when I tried to find that, the closest I could find was Exodus 34, 11 through 16. And here it says, "Observe what I command you this day. Behold, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. You shall tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their asherim, for you shall worship no other god. For the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and when they whore after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and you are invited, you eat of his sacrifice," and that's the key part, "and you take of their daughters for your sons, and their daughters whore after their gods, and make your sons whore after their gods." Now, I don't know why people kept pointing to this passage, but the key issue here is that little bit about eating of his sacrifice. As probably anybody who's taking the time to write this knows, or to watch this knows, there was a controversy in a different part of the New Testament about what do you do to meat that has been sacrificed to idols, right? Because that's sacrificed to another god, and it is therefore not something you should consume as a Jew. And even as a Christian, you don't necessarily want to do that either. I mean, if I had to choose between something sacrificed to a false idol and not sacrificed to a false idol, all things being equal, I'd probably prefer the one that wasn't. But apparently this was customary every time they'd kill an animal to sacrifice it to some particular god. And of course, Paul basically says in that section where that's addressed is, it doesn't really matter. God is bigger than all these false gods. Is no big deal. What do we care? But if it's going to offend somebody's conscience, then just avoid it. Conscious, not conscience. Conscience? Conscious. Conscience. I was right the first time. Anyway. So with that in mind, there was this idea that you would not eat meat that was sacrificed to false idols. And that seems to be something that's prohibited here. Or at least that's how the Jews took it. So in the Jewish mind, by sitting down with them, it's like you are eating that meal with them. All the meal is kind of shared. I think more literally in that there would just be, not like everybody got their combo meal from McDonald's, more potluck. You plop your thing on the table and I think everybody share. At least I read some commentaries that seem to imply that. So you would be arguably violating this law. Or maybe it's not arguable. I don't know. I just haven't thought it through enough. Now, on top of this, the reason it gets complicated is that there's also a bunch of Jewish customs that were written about these things. And the Jewish customs certainly said you were not supposed to be eating with the Gentiles. I'm having a hard time expressing this, so I'm just going to read my notes directly. Basically, from what I'm getting, joining someone's table is like being joined with them. Though a Jew could still keep the food laws, they'd be joining with people who broke them and were therefore ceremonially unclean and breaking this rule. So from, I guess, something, I didn't write down whether this was a book or website or what, but something called Notions of Gentile Impurity in Ancient Judaism. A little quote that says, "Gentiles ate impure foods, came into regular contact with impure substances, and what is worse, committed idolatry and defiling sexual acts." So these Gentiles are gross, is basically the gist of it. And if you eat with them, then you're also gross. So this was definitely the case in the Jewish mindset. I'm just not quite sure if this was exactly the biblical mindset. It seems debatable to me. So with this mindset in mind, we're going to see a little later in a section that we're not covering today, that Paul mentions the idea that if Jesus is joined to us while we are sinners, doesn't that make Jesus a servant of sin? And I think maybe that's a similar idea. It's like that if you're associating, if you're binding with somebody, if you're if you're with someone and that person is sinful, then doesn't that make you sinful by extension? Which it's kind of a different thing. I just thought I'd mention as we were going along. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. So often listen to different preachers talk about passages, and some people, a black preacher I saw this as a form of racism, or at least a close analog to racism. And yes and no. I guess more no. I don't think it's fair to call it racism, because wasn't based on race. It was based on whether you were keeping the religious ideals. I think you can draw some parallels to it, though, which are, not, I think that's fine as an applicational thing. But it was based on actual Mosaic law or tradition, or a combination of the two, and it wasn't about the race per se. Although, wouldn't be surprised if there were lots of elements to that. I'm not saying that was not the thought in any Jewish people's heads, but that's not the gist, the specific reasons that are given for them separating out. So yeah, Peter is a coward here. He's a coward. And I say he's a coward because, again, before it happened, he was there. He had no problem with it. He knew the difference in right and wrong. He knew that this was fine to eat with him. But then when people showed up and he had a chance of something going wrong, a controversy starting, reputation being damaged, whatever, that's when he backed off. And something that's interesting, I thought, I can't find it in here, but I know at some point I looked up some passages about cowardice. Cowardice is not something I typically think of as a sin. It's not something like we talk about in church, or, that I've ever really heard anybody talk about very much in church that I can think of. But according to the Bible, it is. That's actually, in Revelation, it's mentioned there. I think it's mentioned like one other place in the New Testament. But yeah, giving in to pressure, not being able to stand in the face of adversity, that's sinful. And unfortunately, Peter crumbled here. So we need to make sure we are keeping a stiff backbone. And this comes to mind, it seems to me that Peter might have just trying to be avoiding a conflict here, which is understandable. There are definitely some times where it's worthwhile to avoid conflicts, but there are times where you can't. At least you can't avoid the conflict by giving in to people who are wrong. You might be able to avoid it some other ways, but you can't just go along with them if they're doing something that's wrong. And I think about situations where people are talking about political issues and, somebody's got some ideas that are wrong, and or maybe even you're talking about something with a friend and then some other people come by that you're not so comfortable with and they disagree, and you're like, let's quiet down and let's just avoid it. And maybe it's okay. Same thing with religious issues. We feel there's a lot of political and religious pressure against conservatives and Christians anyway. But, and it's a little bit the other way too. But regardless, that sort of desire to let's just avoid it. And sometimes, in those contexts, it can be fine to avoid it, I think. But at the same time, there's times to talk. And again, I think the key thing is you can't actively go as far as doing something that's wrong. We know definitively you can't do that. And that's what Peter did here, unfortunately. So some people, I haven't looked into this, but I've saw multiple commentaries suggesting this, so it would seem there's probably something to this. A lot of people thought that this eating together could be tied to a couple of things. One is apparently there was something called a love feast that they would often, agape feast, that everybody come together and eat, and it was just kind of like that potluck sort of thing. And a lot of people would also tie it to communion, saying, hey, everybody's sitting down together and eating. And I don't know a lot about communion. I grew up in a church that just did it once a year, and I've found out in more recent times there are lots of churches that do it every week, and I just don't know the history. It's not something I've looked into it, so I don't know exactly what to think about all that. But it seems like, I don't know the historical backings, but a lot of people think that might have been connected. And you can see if the communion is supposed to be something that in part we're saying we're all partaking of the flesh and blood of Christ, his sacrifice for us, we're taking part in his nature. And Peter is saying, yeah, we're gonna go over here, and you guys got your thing over here. That's a problem. That's a big problem. It's also a problem if it's just a feast like the potluck sort of thing, and you're saying, well, we don't want to eat with you people. It's a problem there too, but especially if it's a communion, and it's hard to imagine if whenever they did a communion, they would be sharing that if they weren't even sitting together at table, right? I should be clear, it does not say that this was communion. We cannot be specifically certain that that was the case. But it's within the possibility of meaning that was the case, that Peter was like, no, we got one communion over here, you got one communion over there, we're not sharing. All right, so moving on. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. So it wasn't just something contained to Peter, it was like a mass exodus. It was like all the Jews were like, whoop, let's go over here. And we have the Jewish Christian church and the Gentile Christian church. We no longer have one church. And if you didn't believe me before that Peter knew perfectly well what was that he was in the wrong here, well, what does Paul say here? He says that Peter was acting hypocritically. Well, hypocritically means he knew what was right, he knew what was wrong, and did the wrong thing anyway. Also implies many of the other Jews that were there knew better, because they, it was just the men from James who were visitors, it would seem. The rest of them were there day in, day out, presumably eating with the Gentile Christians, and all of a sudden now they're making an issue with it because peer pressure. Which brings up a good point. Peer pressure is a thing. We can all say we don't think we're susceptible to it, but I don't think it's true, probably for anybody. At least very few people are actually completely immune to the peer pressure. And coming back to what I talked about more in the last lesson, the church has a lot of roles. I think this section teaches a lot on the role a church can play, and it can play a role in causing positive peer pressure of a certain way to act. Now, I don't want it to be used as like a tool of intimidation and abuse, because that could be a problem, but in terms of being like, yeah, this is the way we should act, and giving a positive example of that, encouraging that, and discouraging bad behavior in not a extremely rude way, but in like that's not good. That's good. That is some positive, that's some good way to use peer pressure, and there's nothing wrong with that. But here they're falling to the wrong sort of peer pressure. I'm reminded of that prank that you probably, many of you may have seen. You can find it on YouTube if you want, but they just have an elevator prank where people get on an elevator and there are a bunch of people on the elevator and everybody gets on and faces towards the back, even though it's clearly a mirror that with no gap. There's no opening at the back of the elevator, and people get on facing the normal direction, and then as they're riding the elevator, you can see them slowly and everyone they show, I don't know if there's anybody who resisted, but everyone ends up turning around slowly because everybody else is facing the other direction, and it's like, you feel weird, right? And, there are reasons God built us that way, to be sensitive to those sorts of things, but, people know perfectly well that's not going to work, that there's no opening back there, and you'll still do it anyway. We all like to think we'd not be those people to give in, and maybe we wouldn't, but chances are good we would. It takes a lot of backbone to stand up against that peer pressure, so we have to know what's important and what's not. And of course, just in a larger way, another thing to keep in mind is, let's not act hypocritically. There's a lot of room for that. I don't think it's worth going into further. You know what I mean. All right, so a couple of quotes I pulled from Enduring Word, who quoted other people. Sadly, others would follow Peter's lead. The sins of teachers are the teachers of sins. That's kind of a little fun phrase. The sins of teachers are the teachers of sins, by a guy named Trapp. Their withdrawal from table fellowship with the Gentile believers was not prompted by any theological principle, but by craven fear of a small pressure group. He still believed the gospel, but he failed to practice it. And I did not get the quote of who that was. No man standing is so secure that he may not fall. If Peter fell, I may fall. If he rose again, I may rise again. We have the same gifts that they had, the same Christ, the same baptism, and the same gospel, the same forgiveness of sins. And that's from Luther. All right, so it's actually pretty funny when I realized this. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with them, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. Barnabas? So a couple things from Barnabas. This is from Enduring Word. This was amazing. Barnabas was Paul's trusted friend and associate. Barnabas stood beside Paul when he first met the apostles. Barnabas sought out Paul and brought him to Antioch to help with the ministry there. Acts 11:24 says of Barnabas, he was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, yet Barnabas also failed at the critical test. And what's so funny about this is Barnabas was the one that brought Paul to Antioch. Remember, he's the one who took him to the Galatian region in the first place. So he was the one who's like, boy, we got a lot of believers here. Let's start a church. Let's get this organized. Let's make sure they're learning the right things. So it's like this is basically the equivalent of your own pastor coming to church and saying, yeah, I know I led a bunch of you guys to the Lord, but I don't think you're really Christians. or we're going to have a cool guys club and a lame guys club, and you guys are all in the lame guys club now. You're still Christian. Maybe you're second tier Christians, you know. I don't know exactly what was in their head at the time. Again, they seemed to, at least on some level, they were acting hypocritically, so they knew better, but they weren't acting that way. And just, oof, that's a rough Sunday when your church tells you you're not, or your pastor tells you you're not really a Christian, even though he's the one who told you how to become a Christian in the first place. It's a bad day. The defection of Barnabas was of a far more serious nature with regard to Gentile freedom than the vacillation of Peter. Barnabas, the foremost champion of Gentile liberty next to Paul, had become a turncoat. That's by a guy named Wust, or West, I don't know how to pronounce his name. It is possible that this incident, by producing a temporary feeling of distrust, may have prepared the way for the dissension between Paul and Barnabas, which shortly afterwards led to their separation. That's by Lightfoot, which is an interesting idea. We probably if you're watching this, you know this, but just in case, we'll read about the separation of Paul and Barnabas in Acts 15:36. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord, and see how they are," which obviously was a useful thing considering the Galatians went awry so quickly. Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia, and had gone with them to the work, and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him, and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So yeah, just an interesting idea that maybe Mark seems to be in the breaking point, but maybe this defection, as some called it, in the Galatian churches or at Antioch, was something that caused a problem before that. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with them, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, "If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile, not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews?" So, nothing really to say about the beginning of that. The truth of the gospel, he's not acting in accordance with that. You know, the gospel, if you truly believe it, is going to have an impact on your life, and one of those things is not going to be to act like some Christians are second-hand citizens, or second-class citizens, I should say. I said to Cephas before them all, "If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews?" So there's a big question here about in what way was Peter acting like a Gentile and not like a Jew. Well, clearly he's doing it with the food stuff. Other than it seems like, you know, this food stuff, we're not given anything in particular that Peter was doing. He wasn't eating with he was eating with the Gentiles, which maybe is breaking the Mosaic law, definitely is breaking the Jewish traditions. So is that what it's talking about, or is there something else? It just doesn't seem to say one way or another, but he was not living like a Jew. However, he seems to be insisting that the Gentiles, to be real Christians, would have to live like Jews. So Peter's saying there's a hypocrisy here. And this would seem to imply the fact that the entire theme of the book of Galatians is very clearly the idea that you have to keep the Mosaic law to be justified, to be a real Christian, would certainly seem to imply it wasn't just tradition that Peter was breaking, not just Jewish customs, but rather actual law, Old Testament laws in some ways. Like, I don't know if he's eating ham or what, but for Peter to say, you're expecting the Gentiles to live like Jews for you to be able to eat with them, and tying it into this being the springboard for the entire conversation about justification is not by the Mosaic law, it would seem to be tying all that in, that Must have been a particular Mosaic law that Peter was breaking. And again, it might have been as simple as not eating, meat sacrificed to idols. That might be the idea that was in mind here. But something was going on. So Peter, in some way, was acting hypocritically. He was certainly putting a burden on the Gentiles that was not appropriate. So we know the biblical model of having a problem with your brother and resolving it is go to them first in private, and then bring some brethren with you. And then, if they won't respond to all that, then you bring it to the entire church. So with that in mind, why is Paul making this a big public show? Because can you imagine how embarrassing this must have been? It would have been a big ordeal, him calling Peter out in front of everybody. Well, it doesn't specifically explain, but here's some food for thought as to why this might have been the case. Oh, also remember that Paul earlier in this chapter, when he brought this controversial issue up of, what he was teaching, this potentially controversial issue, and he talked to the people of influence, the pillars of the church, in private. Here he's doing it out in front of everybody. So why? Well, here's some ideas. It's possible, and this I'm listing these in order to the weight I attribute to them. So this is the least of them. We're working towards the better explanations, but it's possible that Paul was actually in the wrong here. It doesn't say necessarily the way he handled this issue was appropriate. However, it doesn't say it was inappropriate either, and you'd think Paul probably wouldn't bring it up if it was something that made him look bad, since he's been trying to explain his whole case for having authority here, and he's trying to use this as a springboard for all his arguments. So it'd be kind of weird to say, and here's an example of me flying off the handle. It'd be a little strange, and the Bible doesn't say it, so I don't think we should assume that. I think we should, all things being equal, probably assume that he was in the right for doing this. He certainly seems to be suggesting he was in the right. We know he was right in his content. Whether he was right in his message, well, it's possible he should have found a better way to say it, but another thing is, like I said before, this was hypocritical. It's not like Peter was some guy who had never considered the issue. It's not like Peter was somebody who had never heard out the reasons for why it should be fine to eat with Gentiles, how they're just as much Christians as anybody else. Paul just explained how they had gone to Jerusalem and had this conversation. Peter knew better. So it might have been the hypocrisy that made it like no, we don't need to have this on a private level. We don't need to keep this on low key. This is something that needs to be confronted immediately. And of course, Paul was probably very passionate, since this was a church that he had shepherded himself for so long, which doesn't make it right or wrong, but might explain the context. Another thing is that Peter was so influential that this was causing an immediate problem in the church. And I think this one has a lot more weight to it. I think the fact that it was having immediate effect on the church that was causing a huge division, was causing huge problems. I mean, can you imagine, you know how people talk. Can you imagine if they'd waited 24 hours to deal with this? How far apparently there's two churches now. How much worse it would have been 24 hours from then? Could have been a lot worse. So some things need to be nipped in the bud real quick, and Paul clearly thought this was one of them. So it could be the influential nature of Peter. I mean, we see all the Jews separated with him. That made it such a pressing issue that felt like you had to deal with it right now. And the final thing is, and I think this is probably a good principle, and probably I wouldn't 1,000% embrace it, but feel like I'm about 93% there. I think public sin probably deserves a public condemnation, or at least it's okay with it getting a public condemnation. It's not off the table as an option. Let's put it that way. Public sin is not off the table to make a public condemnation on a public sin. How about that? I think that is reasonable. This isn't something that was some small issue where Peter had made a mistake in like the privacy of his home, or even like out to dinner. This was in front of everybody, a sin that, again, everybody saw, everybody was reacting to at that moment. It seems appropriate to be able to address that publicly. Same thing with, we have all these public preachers who are, with the internet and all sorts of media these days. We have all these people that are very well known. You don't have to go to them in private to criticize them. They have platforms of millions sometimes. Just tell them. Just like, if you see a problem, you can call it out. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be gracious, of course, but you gotta let people know. So that seems that's some food for thought. I think the fact that it was big urgent issue, and the fact that it was public sin changed the context of how it needed to be handled. So come back to niceness again to wrap up on this note. I mentioned this last time, but again, niceness isn't a Christian value. I like the way, I think this is taken from Enduring Word. Yeah, it is. It isn't hard to imagine the scene. They all had a good time until Paul spoiled the party. He probably wasn't shouting, but he did speak with firmness in his voice. And as he told everyone that Peter didn't live under the law of Moses, the certain men from James looked amazed. Their faces showed surprise. What? Peter, the most prominent of all the apostles? Peter doesn't live under the law of Moses? Peter eats bacon and lobster? Peter eats with the Gentiles? As for Peter, his face became red, his heart beat faster, and he just felt sick to his stomach. Everyone else just felt awkward and wished the whole problem would go away. So Paul made a scene. It was a big scene with Peter, and then Paul made it an even bigger scene. And yet, by confronting it, they were able to resolve the issue and cause healing, worthwhile healing, because you don't want things to... This just occurred to me, but if you have a broken bone or something, and you don't get it set, then it will heal in a certain sense, but it's not going to heal correctly. It's going to heal out of joint. And, this big problem, if Paul hadn't addressed it, it might have healed in a certain sense, but it's not going to heal the right way. It's not going to be healed set right. So Paul, by confronting this, even though it wasn't really nice and agreeable and pleasant, and it was confrontational and rough and uncomfortable, it was actually a good thing. It did good. Niceness is not a Christian value. You can be nice as a Christian, but you don't have to be nice. And if you're always nice, you're probably actually in sin, because you need to be disagreeable sometimes and let them know, hey, there's problems with your behavior. You deserve condemnation before God. You will face him one day. Repent. That's Christian value. Whatever you want to call that. Calling people to repentance is a Christian value. Truth-telling is a Christian value. Of course, that doesn't mean be a jerk. We should be slow in judgment and quick to forgive. But there is a role for judgment. There is a role for calling a spade a spade. There is a role for confrontation. And, again, in terms of lessons we can learn from this is a really good reason not to put ministers on a pedestal. Like, the people who should be most excited, most urgently telling you not to put ministers on a pedestal should be the ministers themselves. They should be telling you, don't think too highly of me. Now, there is a problem with people thinking too lowly of ministers. I think that's probably a problem as well. But probably a much greater problem is thinking, at least most people I would think, at least most Christians, is thinking too highly of them. They're just people. Peter, even though was probably the most prominent Christian at the time, he messed up. He messed up big time. Paul set him right. And we need to be teachable. We need to have proper understanding of who we are. By the way, Peter took Paul's correction and he repented. We see Peter later talking about Paul as not only a good minister and a good teacher, but also somebody who's writing scripture. So clearly, Paul was in the right. And this is another thing we can learn about the way the church is supposed to function. There's supposed to be sometimes confrontation, sometimes correction, but there's also supposed to be forgiveness and humility. So, and we'll see that by the time we get to Galatians 5. Or is it Galatians 6? I forget. Galatians 6. This is laid out in particular. Is it Galatians 5? I don't recall. We'll find out when we get there. I want to say Galatians 6 off the top of my head. Anyway, that's where we are this time. Boy, that was a really long one. Yeah, it always goes that way. But there was some dense stuff to say in here. So a lot of little things, I guess. There wasn't like one big thing, but a lot of little stuff to point out there. So hopefully it was helpful. Next time we're going to cover to the end of chapter 2, and the main theme of that is just he's really going to start getting deep into the theological issues, and he's going to say, we are justified by faith, not the Mosaic law. Understand it, get it through your head. It is faith, 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 which is pretty much all he's going to say for the next 3 chapters, but he's going to say it a lot of different ways. And but basically just next section is he's just going to try to explain as clearly as he can exactly what happened when you became a Christian, when you trusted Christ, and that's it. All right, catch you later. Bye.